wholeness comes from the inside out.
When we're living congruently with our values, there's happiness because there is that sense of wholeness.
Wholeness is when the way of your being matches the truth of your being.
In this episode, I want to introduce a new series on energy healing, energy therapy, or energy work, whatever you want to call it. And I hope by the end of this series, which might not be linear, it might be something we jump into every so often, but I hope that we can look at some of the different kinds of modalities, learn what they're all about, and figure out which one you would like to learn more about, or ways that they can support you. Unless you've been living under a rock, you have probably interacted with energy work in some way. For the rest of us, we might even be using rocks to interact with it. You might call these rocks healing crystals or stones, but every store from Walmart to Dollar Tree are selling products like gemstone jewelry, essential oils, smudge kits to support certain intentions. They carry meditation and yoga products, books, and more. If you've been to a chiropractor, a holistic healer, yoga, or had an EMDR treatment, you are interacting with the concepts that energy healing is based on. We each have a subtle energy system. And in a peer-reviewed paper from George Washington University Medical Center, published in the National Library of Medicine, it states, I'll put a link below for this system, the subtle energy system, is defined in terms of cellular and systems communication. And I think that's such a simple concept. It's this communication that's happening on a cellular level between those systems, between that circulatory system or the nervous system or the skeletal system. There's some kind of communication happening that we don't yet quite understand. That's the subtle energy system. It's that communication happening between there, and in ancient times, they've put a whole system to it. If you go to thewholenessnetwork.com, you can get a free subtle energy class, like a mini class, if you subscribe down in the footer. Go to www.thewholenessnetwork.com. I'll put a link in the notes again, and you can get that free, informative, subtle energy class, or a little bit about the subtle energy. And we'll talk about that more in another episode. So the George Washington University Medical Center paper states, quote, "The study's goal is to document the numerous interactions of the endocrine, immune, nervous, and stress systems that so profoundly impact human functioning. It explores the mental and emotional issues pertaining to stress and relaxation and how each impacts the physical body. It proposes scientific justification for broad integration of mental emotional issues into the practice of medicine. Stress and relaxation also are ideal precursors to looking at the role of spirituality in healthcare." Here's where we get into a little bit of trouble, where it gets tricky, I should say. That big word, spirituality. This term almost has as many meanings for people as there are people. And it should be that way. The whole point of spirituality is meaning, connection, and what meaning belongs to something is really subjective to the person. So, that subjectiveness just rubs up against this scientific method. So, but they're not meant to overshadow each other or to undermine each other. In this published paper by the George Washington University of Medicine, they stated their goal as, quote, "to pull together recent medical research and ancient philosophical concepts to establish that comprehensive healthcare must involve thorough attention to the mind and spirit, not just the body. A novel paradigm for healthcare that incorporates the mental, emotional, and spiritual facets in a practical but integrative manner. The paradigm is based on literally hundreds of studies over 20 years of research. Most books currently addressing emotional or spiritual components of healthcare tend to be inspirational or religious in nature, an area generally considered hands-off to physicians. And here again, this is where we're having some trouble. These people are talking about it, and somehow we've decided that that can't match up with these people, where science and spirituality, or maybe even religion, aren't supposed to play together. And these guys are asking the question, why? Or saying, but if it does matter, why aren't we looking at it? It is in this hands-off area that energy healing or energy medicine or energy work has hit a wall. There has not been a consensus in the medical field about the efficacy of this work. And in the religious world, these concepts have been felt to be in competition with spiritual practices or beliefs. So both sides are kind of being resistant to it. And me, myself, have felt that resistance. And it's been really hard to hit up against both of those areas and try to be valid in this place that I am. So that is what this series is going to tackle. We will actually look at the individual modalities and learn about their development and usage. We will look at champions as well as criticisms, and I hope to bring on experts to share more about their work, the particular modalities that they're in. There are so many modalities. Just to name a few, there's Reiki, acupuncture, EFT tapping, somatic experiencing, body talk, aura cleansing, shamanic healing, sound healing, reflexology, reconnective healing, pranic healing, Qui-Gon healing, quantum touch, therapeutic touch, and intercessory prayer, just to name a few. And if you have any more, please send me those suggestions. Put them in the comments or send me an email and say, hey, there's this particular one. And we get a little tricky here because everybody likes the ones they like. And, I kind of get into this competition, this capitalistic ideas here. And again, those are things that belong in the other world. We're kind of moving into a different world where collaboration, and uniqueness can exist at the same time, and the competition doesn't need to be there. But that's kind of how we've been trained or programmed, and so trying to move into this space and let go of those kind of competitive or mine is better or here's the right way or this method or this history is more important than that. That kind of muddies the water. So we kind of just want to be observers of that and to have conversations about it in a way where we can recognize within our own selves our own biases. And those biases will show up through sensations in the body. So we might not look in depth at all of these, or maybe more that I didn't mention, like I say, ones that you bring in, and if you know an expert, let me know. I'd love to interview them. But I imagine that it won't take too many of these kinds of learning about them that we see how they are related and how they work on similar principles and concepts. I particularly myself, I have been trained in Reiki, I have been trained in tapping, energy profiling, energy medicine, shamanic healing, trauma release, and something called heart-centered therapy. But when people ask what I do, and it's kind of hard to say when it comes to a real session. A session just really takes on a life of its own. And this is the virtue and the vice of energy healing. It is hard to study one or to say one particular technique because it's usually a mix in sessions that I do, and most of the people that I work with, a lot of intuition comes into play. And it's where the client guides me that tells me which approach to take. So I can tell you one thing though, it is the connection with the client that means the most. You can call it love, intuition, mirror neurons, or whatever you want to call it. But it is an unseen communication happening. And when I quiet myself and lean into this connection, healing comes. When I tune into that communication of the subtle energy system, it's so obscure, it's hard to even define what it feels like to be, or sounds like, or looks like to be connected to that. But when I do, I see profound healing takes place. And that word healing deserves a little tangent for a minute. This is something that gets really stuck in people's mind because we're associated with healing, number one, with a medical ailment, or two, with people that are trying to swindle you, healers that are trying to swindle you. It's been many decades, maybe even centuries, where there have been people that are trying to trick you into buying whatever they're selling and calling it a cure, because when we're not feeling well, we're vulnerable and we don't want to feel that way. We want to do anything we can to get out of feeling terrible, and people take advantage of that. In another paper published by the National Library of Medicine, in an in-depth study consisting of in-depth open-ended interviews with doctors regarding the definition and mechanism of healing. So they wanted to really look at that word healing. But they were subjected to grounded theory content analysis. So there was a framework. They weren't just giving their opinion. They had to work within this framework. And when they did this study, and I'm quoting from the paper, the result, in there it says the results, healing was associated with themes of wholeness, narrative, and spirituality. Healing is an intensely personal, subjective experience involving a reconciliation of the meaning an individual ascribes to distressing events with his or her perception of wholeness as a person, unquote. I love that quote, of course. It is, even those words there, what does wholeness mean to you? We ask that in our podcast. What is this narrative and spirituality? Even their result is not, they come to the end and they say, really, it's all about the perception the individual has, the perception of themselves returning to wholeness. That is what healing means. And that's what I really want to stress here. Because there are some people who are dying and they feel whole or healed. They're moving into the next realm fully healed, if that makes sense. There are some people who come to this work, and even I have been amazed. I have stories, several stories, plenty of stories, where somebody has come to me and we've had a session, and then they're telling me that this physical ailment they have no longer hurts or is not bothering them anymore. That wasn't even the goal of the session. That wasn't necessarily my intention. My intention is always to heal, but I don't know what that looks like. But I don't know if I could, I don't know if I would promise somebody, oh, you've got headaches, I can take those away. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes that's really frustrating as a practitioner. But I've learned to embrace it, that leaves room for the individual to exist in their own experience, and whatever that experience or however that experience looks best for them, whether they're aware and choosing that experience, or if their higher self or someone else is choosing that experience. So healing is not the same thing as being cured. However, the idea in these studies and in the theories of almost all of modalities, like I say, is that if we move people into this state of healing, then that might have a connection to curing some ailments. So it's like we've kind of found this middle space to go into. We haven't made it a linear line where if we do this, then this comes. But we're that's what this is all about, is there's this space in between illness and cure that maybe we can get into to facilitate the cure instead of a direct line. There's something in between. We do, so far in our Western world, I would say, have real agreed upon links between stressors or negative experiences and physical health. When you go to the doctor and you have any kind of ailment, he's going to ask you, that might be part of the conversation. Are you under stress? And they can tell you, hey, stress there's more likeliness to have this and this and this. There's correlation to it, and enough correlation that we can suggest some things, but it's not like an actual mathematical equation that comes out the same answer every time. One of the greatest pieces of data or the study that we have that correlates these two is the ACE study. The ACE study started years ago. I'm just going to paraphrase. There was the doctor I was trained in. I took a training where he spoke, and they were trying to do weight loss because they found that having obesity was causing heart disease and diabetes and all these things. So there was like, hey, if we get rid of this factor, maybe that's the cure. That's the problem. That's the problem, is the obesity. So they did this study, and they started to find that they could easily with it, they could pull the weight off. Like, they were pulling the weight off. And it was interesting even being in this training, because I never really thought about it, but they could pull the weight off and then keep them healthy at the same time. So they could restrict their food intake all the way down. I think it was like these nutritional shakes they were giving them, and they could just get the weight off kind of quickly, and yet their health wouldn't go down. Like if you just starved somebody, then you might be causing other problems, right? So this was what this study was about. How can we pull this weight off? Well, to some of the women, they could not pull off enough, or they would pull the weight off and then it would come back on. And how the story goes, they started to realize that they had some dysfunction in their childhood. And I'll let you study more about the beginnings of this test. But what has come, I think this test is 20 years old, if not more. And what they have found, very highly correlated, like it's to the point where we're starting to see pediatricians look at these markers in childhood with a high degree of clarity that they will turn into ailments later in the future or dis-ease. And they've come up with a 10-question study, or a 10-question test. And you can take this test if you go to michellewingle.com and scroll to the bottom of the homepage. I link right there to a test, and you can take this test for yourself. Now, these are 10 questions, and even the man who put together this test will tell you that there's a lot of nuance to these questions. So again, it takes like really taking this test, going into yourself, feeling those sensation that says kind of little tug that's like, it's not exactly that, but that matters. And when I've talked to people, I even tell them, give you a half a point or a fourth of a point if you think that's just, it's not exactly worded the way you would word it, but it's not completely false, right? So, and that's the thing. These are kind of like, it's got to be 100% false. So these studies, this study looks at these different areas. Abuse, it looks at physical abuse, which is, again, even in physical abuse, there might be some that say, well, no, I wasn't physically abused, and yet they were spanked regularly. And so they would say no, although that is considered physical abuse. The determinant of whether you deserved it or not is irrelevant. And we could even go into a tangent about deserve, right? But physical abuse, did you experience that from the age of 0 to 18 is the time frame for these things? Was there emotional abuse or being made fun of or not asked how you were feeling? If you came home from school and somebody wasn't there to say, hey, how was your day? Or if they did and you knew they really didn't care, that's emotionally abusive. Or, of course, sexual abuse, which might be something more along the lines of being exposed to sexual things before your maturity level was ready for those things. Like I say, you got to kind of look at these with a broad stroke, but abuse, physical, emotional, sexual. Neglect is the next area. So physical neglect, whether you didn't have a lot of food. And again, not having a lot of food might be because we didn't have a lot of money. It's not that your parents were making you not eat. It was an experience. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's not you had mean parents. It is these experiences that have an effect. And that's the thing. Once we know about these, then we can maybe do something about it. But knowledge is powerful in our health and well-being. So physical neglect, again, emotional neglect. So again, I kind of talked about that in abuse. Emotional abuse might be more like name calling or belittling, that type of thing, or telling secrets to a young child, like sharing your emotional part of your life with a child who's not old enough to be able to understand them. Where neglect may be that not having someone to talk to about your experiences. And not being able to talk to somebody about your experiences seems just like some, thing that's not important. It's a biological need. And when we don't get it, it registers in the body as a trauma. The last area that they look at is household dysfunction. So was there somebody in your household growing up that had mental illness? Was anybody incarcerated, within degrees of the family? So a lot of times in the test, sometimes the question might say, did somebody in your immediate family go to jail? And you're like, no, but my uncle did. And that caused but it was impactful on my family cause, I would make that mark. Mother was treated violently. And another one of these are experiences, remember. So, for instance, in my case, I have a memory of my mom being treated violently. Like, I could easily dismiss it. There wasn't necessarily hitting, but it was a violent encounter that I witnessed. And so I have an ACE score of 1, or, that counts as 1 point for me because it was a one-time thing. These are not overgeneralized. Your parent didn't care for every time you had an emotional need, maybe that doesn't matter. But if there's this impactful moment that you remember, that's a point. Substance abuse, someone in your family or in your household or close to you had a substance abuse problem. And the last one is divorce. By simply having a divorce in the family or your parents were divorced, there's an ACE score of 1. The correlation that they have with this is astounding. People with an ACE score of 4 are twice as likely to be smokers and 7 times more likely to be alcoholic. Having an ACE score of 4 increases the risk of emphysema or chronic bronchitis by nearly 400%. And suicide with a level 4, a score of 4, suicide increases your odds by 1,200%. People with high ACE scores are more likely to be violent, to have more marriages, more broken bones, more drug prescriptions, more depression, and more autoimmune diseases. People with an ACE score of 6 or higher are at risk of their lifespan being shortened by 20 years. This study should be a huge impact on us and our society for well-being and to look to what makes life feel well, whole, to feel good, to be in wellness. These are huge numbers, huge correlations. Preventing ACEs. So if we can go in now, once we have some ACE scores, once we have those numbers, now we know what we're going to work on in our energy healing sessions. You're not going to find it at the medical doctor. You might get some help in a therapeutic session with a therapist talking about it, but it's well documented that for some people, talking about their trauma or their ACEs re-traumatizes them and causes more problems. This is a part of wellness and healing that the energy world is so great at, going into these particular areas and cleaning up the communication that's happening between the cells and the systems. But if we could prevent the ACE from happening, we could reduce a large number of health conditions. We could reduce up to 21 million cases of depression, up to 1.9 million cases of heart disease, up to 2.5 million cases of overweight and obesity. According to the Center for Disease Control, ACEs are costly. The economic and social costs to families, communities, and society totals hundreds of billions of dollars each year. A 10% reduction, just 10% reduction in ACEs in North America could equate to an annual savings of $56 billion. I'm wondering if many of you have heard of these ACEs, if any of you know that there's such a correlation with an experience and your health, and that energy work or energy healing is the bridge between those two. If I could redefine this in energy healing terms, what this ACEs is saying, I would say when there is a disruption in the flow or the communication between systems and cells, remember that's what the study defined our subtle energy system as. When our ease is disrupted, the communication exists, but the messages are not congruent with ease. So the messages become something else. They are diseased. And over time, that communication of disease presents itself. So it's almost like this communication, this is not how it works necessarily, but it's like this communication of this emotional neglect that says your needs don't matter. And so there's this communication inside that's, your needs don't matter, your needs don't matter. And it's kind of like drops of water. It's one time that communication may not do anything, but over time it carves a Grand Canyon. And over so many years, a lot of times we don't see some of these, first of all, the smoking and alcoholism and substance abuse maybe comes in teens, 20s, 30s to try and overcome the dis-ease that is felt within the person. And then the autoimmune diseases or heart disease or things like that usually come in the late 30s into the 40s. It's like that drip of water has been dripping long enough. And now we've hit down to the bone. And once it's hit that bone, then we've got other things we've got to do besides just prevent the water from causing a problem. What the ACE study and energy healers know is that if we can reverse these messages, or process them or program in new messages by easing the communication, particularly in the nervous system, we can start to feel better or have that sense of wholeness is what the study is calling healing. So why the skepticism if there's all this research? Besides the resistance of Western medicine, maybe that resistance is warranted. I want to stop right here and say, maybe it's not all bad to stop and see if there's any truth to the resistance. When I first began my training into energy healing, I made this note in my phone that I keep in there at all times ever since then. I think we're going on 7 or 8 years ago, and this is what I wrote. Most people come to energy work when everything else has failed them, when they are their most vulnerable. It is sometimes a pattern for workers to tell clients what to do. Like they come in and there's like, you've got a block, here's your problem. And then this energy healer, they use their gifts, the energy healer uses their gifts, and they kind of wow the client into handing over agency. This is what I was seeing at the very beginning. And at the time, it feels good to have a partner run your decisions. So you even feel better just to have a partner in the hope that you can feel better. A lot of times these practitioners or gurus or whatever you want to call them are teaching the concept of, quote, I create my life and I determine my destiny. You know, it's like, if I'm happy, then I have health. If I'm sad, I'm going to have disease. And it comes in really sharp. And in a way, though, it's freeing because now I have a sense of control. Then I wrote, but it can be a slippery slope because when things don't improve, then we tell them they have a block or a fault, which feels like a dead end all over again, except there's nowhere else to go. So I wrote, the remedy to me is the first line of energy work needs to be developing the client's knowing, intuition, and sensitivity to vibrations so that they can know truth for themselves. In seeing another story, we have to give space for our error. So we only are able to see what resonates with that space of error. Agency fits it. So what I meant by that was, we're seeing another person's story. I don't care how much great intuition you have. I don't care if you're a medium. You're seeing it through your interpretation. And, you know, the best mediums, even, that's their best gift, is they have fine-tuned their definition so that when that message comes in, they understand what it means because they have this side communication happening. But it's through their own images, they're not seeing the other person necessarily. It's sometimes comes in through images that have meaning to that particular person. And same with, you know, maybe there's a possibility that it works differently, but many times we have our own selves, our own experiences, and we cannot see what we have never experienced before. So we might interpret it in a different way. And we have to recognize that as practitioners, that we still exist in this human frame with human barriers that are beautiful. But if we just pretend like those don't exist, then there's just this risk that someone will just turn their agency over and say, well, what should I do? And then what should I do? And what should I do? And, oh, I've got a block. It's all my fault. Oh, no, I have a headache, or my leg hurts. What did I do? What did I do? And I've seen people get really down and stuck, and it's not fair. So a good practitioner is vital, and that good practitioner knows their limits and is there to serve you, not you to serve their ego. And I will admit that happens in the energy healing world. Not always, but sometimes. So with that, I want to start to open up the different modalities. And I hope you join me in every episode and share them with your family and friends. Pay attention to how you feel as you learn about the different modalities. Notice the resistance inside you and get curious about whether that resistance is a message of warning or incompatibility, or if previous thoughts and beliefs are preventing you from being open about something worthwhile. Maybe that feeling of like, oh, this is uncomfortable. Is that uncomfortable inviting you to get comfortable with it because it's just something you've never heard of before? Or is that uncomfortable a message saying, no, this isn't for me? Really close, but majorly important difference. Or notice the feeling if you're like 100% yes, where do I sign up? Is that message really about wanting something fast and easy, which says more about how much you are suffering? And maybe we need to take time and acknowledge that first. I've done that. I've been there where it's like, get this blocked emotion out of me and then I'm going to feel better. Great, let's do it. I'm done. And what I'm hopping over or bypassing is the fact that I'm that desperate. I'm hurting that much. Deciphering between the difference in this energy of, is it for me? Those sensations of this is great. No, I don't like this. Only you will be able to tell the difference between that it's right for you or that I'll pass. It's not for me. And I honor your journey and your experience with whatever you find best for you. But I'm excited to take this journey. If you enjoyed this conversation, please rate and review in the platform that you get your podcasts and subscribe. Next time, we are going to go over some vocabulary and hopefully turn what you may have called woo-woo into wow. We invite you to the wholenessnetwork.com, where you'll find the Wholeness Library. Inside, you'll find tutorials, downloads, mini classes, and all sorts of streaming content for you on your wholeness journey.